Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband.
In each midweek episode, Richard and I discuss something that's caught our eye the past week and maybe try and put it into a bit of historical context. So Richard, why don't you kick us off?
Well, my matter of interest this week is a response to an article that appeared in the New Statesman written by a columnist, Ollie Dugmore, called "Supporting North Sea Drilling is an Extremist Position." Now, in this article, Ollie argues that anyone who supports drilling in the North Sea for oil and gas extraction is a political extremist. And he has in his immediate mind Reform UK, a party which holds a commitment to scrapping net zero, but that's also something that the Conservative Party also professes. Scrapping net zero, just for listeners' awareness, is scrapping the currently legally binding target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a net zero carbon emission by a specified legal date, and that government activities have to be weighed against this legal requirement, or they may be found to be in violation of the law and subject to judicial review. And in Dugmore's view, anyone who thinks that should be repealed, that law should be repealed, is, in his terms, a political extremist. Now, I have some problems with this article. First is the bad faith move, the obvious bad faith move, to label those who disagree with you as extremist. I find it generally quite unhelpful to do that. It closes down political debate and discussion, which is not just difficult for your political opposition, but it's actually also quite bad for yourself, for the views that you might hold, because I think that good political views have to constantly feel that they are being tested against other arguments that are out there, new evidence, challenges, and the rest. And to say that a set of views that one holds cannot be challenged, questioned, or pushed back at all, I think actually means that you become quite lazy in why you might hold those views that you do, even if they happen to be quite good views. The other thing I found rather curious in Ollie's piece was a lack of real comparative consideration about what's going on here in the world. Now, the piece is framed in part about the desperate situation our planet finds itself in, with a warming climate and climate change and more extreme weather events and the scientific consensus around climate change. And I don't dispute that, and I think only really a minority of people dispute that. What is in dispute, though, or what is, I think, perhaps more valid, is what are the different policy responses that one might take to that climate change? Now, I think Ollie's position possibly might be that the planet is facing an existential crisis, that humanity is facing a potential extinction event, although he doesn't use that term, other climate activists use that term, and therefore the requirements of reducing global warming should prevail over all other considerations. And yet I wonder how far Ollie and people who hold that position would be willing to follow the logic of that argument. Let's say that the climate further deteriorates and we get to a position where scientists say that the only way that the United Kingdom can reach its agreed climate goals, as agreed in the Paris Climate Accords, would be to sterilize half the population, because a growing population contributes to our carbon footprint, or would be to completely ban motor vehicles, or to completely ban all flights, or to slaughter all farm animals in the country, or all cows, because their methane contributes to global warming, or to ban meat consumption entirely in the country, to force everyone in the country to be vegetarian. Let's say that that's what scientists put on the table and said, these are the only things that can be done, or these are the things that are necessary to be done to meet our Paris agreements. Would Ollie say that it is an extremist view to possibly question whether all of those things are good public policy? Or is it worth weighing those objectives against other realities that we face in society and in politics? The other thing I found quite curious in this piece was that there wasn't much consideration about what other countries in the world was doing, with the exception of a rather strange passage that was praising China. So in the piece, Ollie approvingly cites Elon Musk, where he says, as Elon Musk pointed out in an interview with The Economist magazine a couple of weeks ago, China today produces more electricity than the US and Europe combined, an ever-growing proportion of which comes from renewable sources it controls. China has made its bet on the future. First of all, I have to say, that's a very rosy picture of the situation in China. Yes, China is producing an enormous number of electric vehicles. I've seen it on my many trips to China. I've been going to China since 2008, and I've seen the transformation and shift to electric vehicles in China. But let's just point out that half of China's energy comes from coal, that China annually produces 5 billion tons of coal. Britain, at the height of its industrial strength, at the height of the British Empire, at the height of coal production in this country, produced 5% annually of what China is currently producing today annually in coal. But also, if we are facing this truly existential extinction possibility event, and I'm not ruling out that that's the case, but for people who believe that to be the case, then surely the sort of range of actions that we're considering at the moment is totally inadequate. I mean, Norway, for example, is expanding its operations in extracting fossil fuels in the North Sea. If Norway's actions are putting the entire existence of humanity at risk, then don't we need to take tough action against Norway? Don't we need to take sanctions against Norway, punish Norway, potentially take military action against Norway? If this is truly a question of survival, does the RAF need to start sending bombers out to the North Sea and start bombing Norwegian oil rigs? Or should NATO embark in some kind of operation to destroy China's coal mines? Or should the United Kingdom and the United States engage in some kind of activity to topple the Xi Jinping regime and to put forward in China a government that believes in closing down coal mines? Now, all of these actions are not actions, I should make clear, that I am personally advocating. But what I am saying is that if you view the survival of humanity as being at stake here, and therefore any question of net zero policy is extremist, then surely actually your position needs to be a harder position than the one that you are taking.
Well, I think you're right to raise this subject and also to put it in those terms, because it's really easy to say, oh, we must do this as an imperative to do this, when the things that you're demanding don't necessarily affect you. And the impact of winding down North Sea oil extraction in British waters is relatively slight for most London-based journalists. It's really not that if you're in the northeast of Scotland. And by framing it in terms of, well, let's imagine there are things that they would demand of you, vegetarianism, whatever the science may say, or the scientists may argue for, I think you're absolutely right to put it in those terms. I thought the article was basically clickbait, particularly its use of the word extremist. I mean, it's clearly not an extremist position to think that we should be extracting oil from the North Sea, unless you actually believe in another position, which I think is extreme, which is to say that we should stop overnight all use of oil and gas. Because if you don't take that view, and I assume Ollie Dugmore doesn't take that view, then what you're basically saying is that, well, oil and gas has to come from somewhere, but it's extreme to think it should come from British waters. And I don't see why there's any credible case for making that point. I mean, why is British oil and gas worse than Norwegian oil and gas from the same part of the world, or oil and gas from places where they have far worse environmental regulations and protections than we would have here? So I don't think it's an extreme position he was arguing against. And I think calling people who support North Sea extraction extreme was pretty ridiculous. Where there is a reasonable debate, of course, is about what would the impact of extracting North Sea oil and gas be. There's a desire on the part of, certainly Kemi Badenoch has spoken about extracting more oil and gas. In government, Ed Miliband and the last Labour manifesto said there'd be no new licences issued for extraction in the British parts of the North Sea. Andy Burnham seemed to brief, or people close to Andy Burnham seemed to brief, that they took a different view and did want to see more extraction, but then appeared to back down from it somewhat. Part of that debate seems to be over something much more pragmatic, shall we say, than climate change and achieving our objectives according to the Paris Climate Change Accords. And that's basically, will North Sea extraction make energy bills cheaper or not? And there's a very big debate to have around that. Lots of people will say, well, you can give the licenses, but it's private companies that pump it out. And once they do so, they sell on the global market at global energy prices. But in some ways, I think that pushback actually lacks quite a lot of imagination, partly because if you're extracting in British waters, there's British tax revenues that go to the Exchequer that could always be redirected towards subsidising energy bills, or, let's use a bogeyman term in modern British history, but one that Andy Burnham seems to like, you could nationalise the companies or have a national company that's responsible for it and say that actually, well, this will be giving out cheaper oil and gas from British waters. You could be a bit more creative about it. The other issue, which I think is overlooked, in fact, is just the question of energy security. I mean, on the basis that we're not going to have an oil and gas-free world anytime soon, given that we are going to need fossil fuels, then the question fundamentally becomes, how secure is our supply of them? And I think that's often something which we don't hear discussed anywhere near as much as we should. If I'm to make the case for environmentalism, and I do believe very strongly in protecting the natural environment, I think it's hugely important. I actually think net zero has become a distraction from that in a great many ways, in part because net zero is a tremendous spreadsheet exercise. If you believe that reducing carbon in the environment is absolutely essential to protecting the planet and its long-term environmental and ecological health, which of course is the scientific consensus, not dissenting from that. But if you believe that's the case, then doing as net zero often demands, for example, offshoring our emissions, doesn't actually do anything to help with that. I mean, let's just give a quick example. Under the last government, there was a proposal to put a coal mine in Cumbria for coal that could be used for steel production in this country. Now, the government clearly thinks, this Labour government clearly thinks, that steel production is important. It oversaw the nationalisation of part of the remaining steel industry, so it wants steel. The steel-making process in this country uses coal. The coal is used in that process. But when it came to where does that coal come from, rather than create jobs in that part of the country using modern coal extraction practices that would be more rigorous and I think environmentally sound than when coal is taken out of the ground in other parts of the world, the Labour government decided not to fight to open that coal mine, to basically back away from it, that it wouldn't happen. And therefore, what will we end up doing? Well, we'll end up importing coal from other parts of the world. And if that coal comes from, say, China, then do people really imagine that China's environmental protections are as good as they would be when they're removing coal from Cumbria? Let alone the fact that, just add on to that, the fact that the coal then has to be shipped halfway around the world. It strikes me that if you genuinely believe that we need to reduce carbon, then the way in which we currently approach net zero, which is all about what does the spreadsheet say next to the United Kingdom about our carbon emissions, and doesn't seem to care about whether those emissions are just offshored elsewhere or not, I think is a real wrong-headed approach. And of course, just to sum up my thoughts, if we do that, if we deny people in Cumbria jobs, if we deny people in the northeast of Scotland jobs in the oil and gas industry, and like you say, when you put this into an international context, no other countries are doing the same. Norway's increasing their extraction. China with their billions of tons of coal a year. The United States with its approach. Then we can end up in a situation where we've impoverished ourselves for zero impact, basically, on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and the health of the natural environment. And I think that would just be an insane, insane policy.
One additional thought that I've had is that the discussion about net zero in the United Kingdom seems often to be devoid of a discussion of national interest. In an ideal world, if everyone behaved as the United Kingdom behaves, then the costs of a net zero policy on employment, on cost of living, on travel and movement, etc., would be borne around the world, and the United Kingdom would not be putting itself at a particular disadvantage relative to other countries in that approach. But if you have a situation where the United Kingdom is voluntarily shutting down some of its energy sector that could still provide uh, resources that are in demand in the British economy today, and actually quite dishonestly virtue signal over doing that, while at the same time, as you say, Lee, relying on competitor states to provide those resources now, trying to have the best of both worlds, but actually acting in a profound hypocrisy. I'm not sure that that actually deepens British national interests, except for those who want to be able to posture on the world stage about having met these targets, even if it means that we're relying on other countries not meeting these targets. And there is a part of me also, when I've traveled and seen how other countries behave, that I start to think, to put it nicely, how quaint we are, to put it less nicely, how foolish we are to tie our hands in so many different ways around this agenda when other countries just clearly don't give as much of a toss. So when I was in the US earlier this summer, I went to a World Cup match, England versus the DR Congo in Atlanta. Amazing, fun day, match, brilliant. It was in the Falcon American football team stadium in Atlanta. Fantastic stadium, enormous, in the middle of the city, fully air conditioned. And it wasn't a one-off for the World Cup. That's what they do for all their games. They put the top over it and then they air condition the stadium. I thought, God, how much energy is this taking? And when I was traveling through the South, my friends and I, we started in New Orleans and drove through Mississippi and Alabama into Georgia, and we went to lots of different places to get food. Even at sit-down restaurants, we would be served our food in some kind of plastic container, given plastic utensils. The food would be put in a plastic bag, even though they knew that we were eating in. And so you would walk from the counter with your food to where you were sitting, take it out of the plastic bag, eat it in the plastic container, use the plastic cutlery, and then just throw it all in the bin. And that was the standard practice for several of the restaurants that we went to. And I just as I experienced this and just thinking like all this plastic that was going on in the United States, a highly developed country with all kinds of technology to get around with this, they just clearly care less about it, or plastic straws or all this kind of stuff. Now, look, I'm not a climate skeptic. I, like you, Lee, share a profound interest in the future of this planet and a clean planet and conservation. But there has to be a sense of proportionality of what we're doing relative to other countries. Another example I'll give you is last year when I went to India. When I was in Delhi for a week, the air was thick with smoke and smog the entire week. I mean, you could taste the pollution in your mouth when you were outside, and your eyes would start to burn from being outside. And why was that? Well, I was given a variety of different explanations. One was the increase in motor car usage. Another was that farmers in India burn their crops at the end of the season if they have surplus crops, or burn their fields to clear the fields for the next year. And also, people just were, I was told, burn rubbish for fuel and heating. There are all kinds of reasons why that might be the case. As I was in Delhi and experiencing this, so on the one hand, totally horrified that this was all happening, I was thinking of all the different ways in which Britain is putting more and more restrictions on the things that it does, which are much more benign than any of the stuff that I saw in India or in the United States. And you start to wonder why it is. And some people take the view, well, you know, it's a moral obligation to do that. Well, okay, but if it's just a moral obligation to make you feel better, but it's not really going to make a difference in the round, then actually how useful is it? And that's why I go back to my point on this, that if you actually think that we are on the brink of extinction as a species, then actually the policies that people like Ollie Dugmore are advocating are not enough, according to their own logic, in my view. But at the same time, they don't advocate for those much tougher and harsher policies. And so it comes back to, I think, a very good point that you made, Lee, which is that I feel that many of the commentators who talk about climate policy in Britain are often talking about it from the perspective of where, in their position, this personal sacrifice they have to make is actually quite small, even though in other parts of the United Kingdom, the very same policies that they advocate bear a much harsher, particularly economic or material cost. And yet it's a cost that they are prepared for other people to bear on their behalf. And that's one of the problems that I have with the way that this debate is framed.
Just a final point on that. I don't want us to be like the United States in the example that you've described,
No, not at all.
because I would make a distinction between what I've described, perhaps uncharitably, as spreadsheet environmentalism, which is what I think part of the net zero policy comes down to, with actual practical things that do have an impact on the environment, and also quite often the localized environment as well. So, to use the old mantra, I do think it's a good thing in this country if we reduce wasteful use of things, if we reuse things if we can, if we recycle the things that can be recycled. I think that's much better than going back to restaurants giving out plastic cutlery or whatever it was that you found. Maybe an exception to that for plastic straws for what it's worth. The paper ones are obviously hateful. But I do think there's a distinction between that. And I think that extinction exists for most people kind of in their lives, in that I'm always struck by how actually keen people are to recycle, and actually keen people are to reduce their waste and use things and reuse things for other purposes, because they can see very directly that that is reducing the impact that they'll have on the planet, and that they can find additional benefit from certain things. A big part of the issue with the whole way in which we've approached net zero is that it's just worlds apart from people's everyday lives, and therefore feels very alien.
Lee, what is your matter of interest this week?
Well, I wanted to talk about an academic article that I'd come across recently, which is called The Management of British MPs' Postbags and Politician Voter Relations in the Democratic Age. It's by Kit Cowell, who wrote the book Blue Jerusalem, which some listeners may be aware of, about Tory thinking during the Second World War in particular, and also Richard Toy, who's a great historian, including of Churchill, and co-hosts the podcast Finest Half Hour. And the article basically looks, from a historical perspective, at the ways in which people write to their MPs and what it means for them to do so, what they're hoping to achieve, and how MPs manage and process the correspondence that they get. There's a huge amount in the article. I'd suggest, if people are interested, that they look at it. But there are 4 points I really wanted to draw out. One of them is that writing to our MPs is a very, very old tradition in this country, and it predates actually the universal franchise. So it's one of those curiosities of history that if you go to the point, say, before 1928, when all men and women over 21 got the vote, or if you go further back and it varied for men, or when it was over 30 for women, or no women had the vote, Curiously, in that time, the Primrose League, one of those institutions that was there to campaign in politics in the late Victorian, Edwardian, and some decades afterwards in this country, had a lot of women members who got involved in the Primrose League as a political activity, even though they couldn't vote in a general election. Or perhaps you might say because they couldn't vote in a general election. That was their way of having their say. And interestingly, writing to your MP, even when you didn't necessarily have the vote, was part of that. They describe it as being simultaneously a minority pursuit and something millions did over a very long period of time. The second point I wanted to make is that the shift from writing to your MP because you want to express an opinion on something or because you want to find out their opinion on something, to writing to MPs to try and get things done, to try and get an issue sorted, what we would call casework very often, has actually been going on for quite a long time. So it's very common now to say that MPs' inboxes, usually now more relevant than talking about the postbag, are flooded with basically local welfare concerns that people who have got an issue in their lives that they would like help with write to their MPs almost as a first port of call in many cases. But actually, there's some evidence that that has been going on for quite a long time. So one of the figures that they talk about in the piece is that if you go back to 1972 to 3 and look at Tony Benn's constituency correspondence when he was MP for Bristol South East, of the 1,266 letters that he received that year, and it's worth saying that is significantly lower than MPs would get today. So there has been a growth in correspondence over time. But of just shy of 1,300 letters, only 119 offered an opinion or a suggestion on something, or were intended to register a protest about something that was happening in government or elsewhere. All of the rest were casework. So if you go back even more than 50 years, people were writing to their MPs to try and get their help in solving a problem that was affecting them in their own lives, rather than just issues. One of the things that they discuss in great detail in the piece, and it's very interesting the way they put it, is about what do MPs look for in correspondence? What do they take seriously in the correspondence that they receive? And the thing that I would take out of it most, and this chimes with me from when, if I think back now, gosh, it was about 12, 13 years ago, I worked for an MP for a year and was partly involved in handling their correspondence. And it tended to fall into different categories. I mean, this was around about the time when things like 38 Degrees was starting. That's an online platform where you can type in your details and send sometimes a generic, or you can tailor it slightly, letter to your MP about a particular issue that you're concerned about. This was all taking off around that time. And one of the things that you just instinctively felt if you were in an MP's office and helping manage their correspondence is that an email that came from an automated system counted for less, maybe the wrong way of putting it, but I think just put bluntly, counted for less than, say, a 2-page handwritten letter from a constituent. Just the level of effort that had gone into it, just a sense of personal care and input rather than coming from a campaign group, meant that if you got a letter that somebody had sent and stuck a stamp on it, you thought, okay, this person cares enough. And yes, it may only just be one person, but this person cares enough to have written to this MP about this. Whereas the other person might care enough to put in their name and postcode, but that might be the be all and end all of it, really. So I think in part that's yes about effort, but also actually about authenticity and how authentically expressed is a constituent's view with the correspondence that you receive. And they open the article with a great anecdote about this from the mid-1980s, when an anti-abortion campaigner from Glasgow wrote to Enoch Powell, who was by this stage an Ulster Unionist MP over in Northern Ireland. And the correspondent asked, if constituents have, for whatever reasons, difficulty in trying to formulate personal letters to MPs on pro-life matters, is it better for constituents to sign a pre-printed letter rather than do nothing at all? And Powell replied to this person to say, I have to say, what you call pre-printed letters are virtually a dead loss. A member is much more influenced by a letter written by the constituent himself or herself, however ill expressed. And I rather suspect that that theme actually is still true now. I was thinking about the example of maybe when we've heard about correspondence and MPs' postbags most in recent years. Yes, in part about the winter fuel allowance change, but if we wind a little further back to the Partygate scandal and when that was unfolding, and Barnard Castle and the driving for an eye test and all of that controversy, you would often hear Conservative MPs, sometimes say in the Commons, but certainly say to the media, that it was the strength of feeling that they were receiving in their postbag or in their mailbox that really drove home to them how seriously the country took it and how betrayed much of the country felt. Now, I actually suspect in part that if you were just to look at the raw numbers of how many people wrote in about it, it's quite possibly fewer people than, say, who may have signed a generic letter about badger culling or something like that, where you'd often get several hundred very similar letters around that. But I suspect it might have been that people took to their emails in fury at what was reported about the government doing during COVID. And therefore, that correspondence felt deeply authentic, that really alerted MPs to the strength of feeling. So there's some of the points that I made in the article. And the final thought I wanted to throw up about it is maybe some of the ways in which this is changing. So in the article, they talk about, of course, the introduction of the word processor and the introduction of email. And of course, we're now heading towards a time when there's widespread use of AI as well in the writing of correspondence. And I wonder how that will change things next, because that is basically a way in which you could have mass communication to an MP that looks different. So you could say, for example, if you're, maybe they're doing this, if you have a campaign group and you want to have constituents write to a member of parliament, but you want those letters and those emails to appear authentic, you could basically have an AI system that writes varying different versions of it. You could ask that person just to say, tick which aspects of this matter most to you, or write in 10 words your involvement in the local area, and we'll tailor this letter to you so it looks distinct. And at that stage, it might be harder for MPs or the people who help them manage their correspondence to really gauge what is the authentic opinion of a person and what isn't. And that pushes me on to the very final point I wanted to make. And this is something that I see actually from my kind of experience in local government. Is I think one of the great under-discussed and unexplored aspects of modern political communication is Facebook. And particularly if you're of the millennial generation, where you maybe had Facebook when you were in your teens and early 20s, and then it fell away in many ways for you and got usurped by Instagram and some other platforms. There are still a huge number of people on Facebook, a lot of them take an interest in politics. A lot of them use it as almost like a village or community notice board with village Facebook groups and so on that they're interested in. And very often the discussions can be political, and very often it'll be the platform that people go to contact their MPs or to comment on the posts that their MPs are making, to express how outraged they are, or perhaps how, in rare cases, supportive they are of what is happening in Parliament or elsewhere. And so far as I can see, and certainly as I would hope, those comments and that engagement that you see on Facebook seems not to be impacted by AI at the moment. It seems to be actually quite a good gauge of what is the authentic view of people in a local area. And it strikes me as being one of the ways in which that politician-voter relation that this piece focuses on in the democratic age may be changing.
It's funny you mention Enoch Powell's correspondence with his constituents, because I've looked at Enoch Powell's constituent correspondences that are held in the Churchill archives at Churchill College, Cambridge. I was looking at a particular moment in Powell's career, which was around his decision to leave Parliament in the February 1974 election over his disagreements with the Ted Heath government on Europe. And I found an amazing letter that he received from Deepak Nandi, the academic race equality campaigner and father of the current cabinet minister, Lisa Nandi, where Deepak Nandi says to Powell, what a shame it is that Enoch Powell is leaving Parliament and how much he will be missed from Parliament, which is maybe not what you expected to find in Enoch Powell's correspondences. But as a researcher, as a historian, those collections of papers can sometimes be quite fraught to deal with as a matter of scholarship, because occasionally you'll find letters that are from people of some significance, and those letters tell you something about the relationship of politicians with other important people in their world, and identifies networks and connections that maybe you weren't aware that they exist. And much more often, these are letters that come from ordinary members of the public who are not known to us today and maybe not known to anyone except perhaps maybe some of their descendants, if that. And you start to wonder sort of what do you make of this? Because you could say, well, this might be a read of public feeling or constituency feeling on a particular matter. But one of the problems with that is that the people who might feel motivated to write in on our issue may not be representative of what the wider constituency feeling is. It may be that there's a very small group that feels highly motivated and passionate on a particular matter, but actually the majority of voters in the constituency take the opposite view. And that's a problem for historians, but it's also, I think, a problem or a dilemma for politicians. And I don't think that there's an easy answer to this because, on the one hand, politicians ultimately have to be able to represent the views of a majority or at very least a plurality of their constituents if they wish to get re-elected. So they have to take those seriously and ultimately have to represent their views. In an election, it doesn't matter how highly motivated someone feels about an election, it's one person, one vote. On the other hand, these letters are a way to allow for that variation in enthusiasm that isn't always as clearly expressed as at an election, but can make itself known in between elections and may give the politician some pause for thought or some view on how they might try to communicate to their wider electorate about the strength of feeling that this smaller group in their electorate holds. I have to say, as a fairly new elected town councillor, the lowest tier of English local government, nothing like the tiers that you sit on, Lee, at the district and county level, I've started to receive a little trickle of emails to my councillor email address from my constituents. Not that many, I have to say, but I have received some. And I always have to think carefully about what I do about these uh, correspondences, because on the one hand, sometimes they just raise very specific issues, casework issues that affect that person that you can direct a particular response to, fixing something that's gone wrong in the system or that some councils messed up somewhere or they have a particularly, a nice idea to do something. But there's a different category, which is where someone expresses a view on this policy should be X or Y. And I think to myself, well, you're the only person who's written to me about this policy. And so what am I to make of that? I now know your view, and that's useful. But is it my role as a councillor to reflect the view of this one person? Or let's say I was an MP and I had a larger pool of people writing to me. Is that my responsibility? Or is my responsibility to try to think about what the broader view in the constituency might be? And that's a challenging thing. But I have to say personally, I personally have to make myself resist the temptation to try to think, okay, someone's emailed me about this, therefore I must take the position of the one person who's emailed me on this. I sometimes find myself pushing back at constituents who contact me and they say this is their view, and I come back and say, that's interesting, and I take some of your points on, but I don't fully agree, or I think there are other views that are out there, and here's an alternative perspective. And I think actually it would be good if politicians did that a bit more often. I know some politicians do that, but I think having more of a dialogue with constituents through correspondence is a good way of doing it. So not just seeing it as a one-way street where you just dump your opinions on your MP and it's about volume and intensity and heat, but it's actually making more of a discursive connection between your elected representative and the people who they are there to serve. And just one final thing on this point. I always thought it was a nice practice that Barack Obama followed when he was president, where he got his staff to choose 10 letters every day from people who'd written to the White House that represented a range of different views, a range of different people, perspectives, part of the country, ages, etc., etc. And then Obama set aside an hour a day or however long it took him to handwrite short responses. I don't think these were lengthy responses to those letters. And Obama has recently spoken about how meaningful and important that was for him as president to have this sense of a personal dialogue with members of the public in a White House when he's so otherwise isolated from voters. But also now many of those recipients of his letters, now a decade or more since, have come forward and talked about how just even receiving that response, that personal response from the president, made a big difference in their lives in all kinds of different ways. And there's exhibitions in his new presidential library on that. And I thought that was really a sort of touching and nice feature about the idea of correspondence with politicians.
Final point I would add is that small groups of highly motivated people can achieve a huge amount in politics. And really, that's an alternative definition, in fact, for political parties in many ways. But it's certainly true for groups that are organised or motivated with constituency correspondence. And it is a challenge, I think you're right, for everybody who's in an elected position, which I think can only really be overcome by keeping genuinely in touch with random and arbitrary selections of people, by doing the old form of politics, by knocking on doors and having at least a collected sense of, well, how many people slammed the door in my face, what issues did people actually raise, how does that correlate with what I get in my inbox, going to constituency events and so on, and actually meeting representative samples of people. I think it's hugely important because you're right, an inbox or a mailbag will always be a biased source for understanding public opinion. That's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. A few parish announcements before we go. Fairly soon, Richard and I are going to be in North America. We're going to be in Boston and Washington, D.C. in the United States for a time, and also in Ottawa in Canada.
And very briefly in New York and Montreal as well.
And we thought we'd do a quick shout out on the podcast. If you happen to live in those places, we're looking at whether or not we should do some listener meetups whilst we're there. So if you do live in any of those cities that we've mentioned, our contact details are in the show notes. Do drop us a note and we'll see what we can organise. Secondly, just a reminder that you can join our Patreon at the moment, and if you join before Sunday, you'll be entered into a free giveaway draw to win signed copies of the books that Richard and I have brought out fairly recently. In my case, on the Tory leadership, in Richard's case, on the Labour Party in opposition. That's just a little competition that we're doing to mark reaching 100 members of our Patreon. We'd be delighted if you join them, and there you can hear the podcast ad-free. You can also hear bonus content, and you can join in with a discussion with other members as well. On Sunday, we're returning to our Summer Book Club theme, and we'll be discussing the Disraeli myth with Emily Jones. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.